Okay, thank you very much for coming tonight. I am Masaki Kakizaki from Temple University. Just before we start, just small announcements. This event is being videotaped. Okay, so after his speech, we move on to Q&A session. If you are not happy to be recorded, you can ask questions from your seat. If you are okay with being filmed, please walk to the microphone to ask questions. Okay, and smartphones and cell phones, please turn it off or turn it in silent mode. Okay. We have the Wi-Fi here at the campus, but its capacity is quite limited. So I appreciate if you could avoid unnecessary Wi-Fi usage during the event. And today, I'm very happy to have Dr. Matthew Gray from Waseda University. Last year, one of my students from the Middle East asked me to do a 101 independent studies about the politics of Saudi Arabia. I'm teaching the Middle East here. And after inspecting and examining different textbooks, I just adapted this one, Saudi Arabia, the title. And this is very well organized, informative, and comprehensive book to introduce the politics and foreign policy of the Saudi kingdom. Later on, I Googled the author. Just I was curious where he is. And I found out that the author is now based in Tokyo. Of course, the author is Dr. Matthew Gray. And I emailed him and I asked him to give a guest lecture at ICAS. So today we have Professor Dr. Gray. He joined Waseda University 2016, just September, I think. Prior to this, he was at the Australian National University between 2005 and 2016. He is writing about the politics, political economy, and international relations of the Middle East. And he has published 3 books about the region. This one is one of those books written by Professor Gray. Okay, so I think this event is very timely because we have very recent, important and interesting developments over Syria and Iraq and Iran as well. So I think we have a lot to talk about. Okay, so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you all very much for coming tonight. I hope I won't disappoint. I'm going to try and essentially cover as much as I possibly can in as short a period of time as I possibly can, in part because I think there probably will be a lot of questions, and I think also I'd rather be driven by what particularly is of interest to you rather than just focusing on one or two of my pet interests or whatever. So I will give you a few thoughts on certain case studies. I mean, we will talk a little bit about ISIS and Islamic extremism, about Iran policy, about Israel-Palestine and US policy there. And sort of approaching this from the angle of not so much as, I'm not an expert on the US, so I'm approaching this more as question of depending on what Trump decides to do, what sort of impacts are we likely to see from that on the Middle East, and how might the Middle East respond to particular policies depending on the directions in which Trump eventually goes with those. And of course, the jury is still out on a lot of this. There's a lot of elements of US policy where it's still not clear exactly what the Trump administration is ultimately going to wind up doing. In fact, there is, for better or worse, I suppose, not an overarching ideological driver to the Trump administration. Now, my suspicion is that's not so much a weakness of Trump, it's just a characteristic. It's that businessman's approach to management, of saying, they would rather be pragmatic and responsive and adaptable to events rather than be constrained. I think Trump would say it's constraining to have your actions dictated or walled in by an ideology. So for better or worse, that makes him a little bit perhaps more predictable than we might think, but it also can make things difficult, because as events change, so too will the ways in which he may respond. Couple of things. I'm not going to bash Trump. Other people do that better than I can anyway, but also I think we owe it to him and to people of the US to treat it seriously. He's the president, and so I'm going to treat it quite seriously. I'm going to give you some thoughts here that are based on my serious analysis of what I think he and his inner circle and the foreign policy elite in the US are thinking. And like I say, I'm not an expert on the US, so bear with me. I'm coming at that from an angle of ignorance, maybe sort of interested, slightly informed ignorance, but still ignorance at the end of the day. So a couple of things about Trump that we can say. And the first thing is he's been, in a way, quite predictable. I mean, especially in the initial couple of months of his administration, it was unusual to see a politician that was actually getting in and trying to effectively do what he said he was going to do. Now, this has changed a little bit just in the last 48 hours. We've seen a couple of key 180-degree about faces on certain things, on China and the currency, for example. And there are a number of things yesterday where Trump essentially changed his position. But if you look at his initial actions, if you look at the TPP, if you look at the Mexican wall, if you look at the immigration bans, these were all things that he said he was going to do, some of which I really didn't think were practical, some of which may still be constrained by the courts and by the states, but let's face it, it's still him trying to do what he said he was going to do. He is, though, like I say, he's doing this in a context that I describe as sort of post-party politics and non-ideological. What I mean by that is this is not so much conventional left or right, and it's not really based on conventional class bases of support. This is somebody, Trump is somebody who can attract both the white males earning six figures in rural and regional areas, and also the white working class. So it's not so much left and right or working class, middle class. It's, I guess what you'd say is the tasteful versus the popular has become another way of thinking about the class divisions and the political divisions in the US. Are people more concerned about ideas or values or identity or equity, or are they more concerned about individualism, freedom, economic openness and things like that? This is why he crosses, I think, some of the old boundaries that you wouldn't have seen politicians cross in the past. This is why he can be pro-rich when it comes to tax, but also populist when he's addressing ordinary workers. And not just in what he says, but in how he implements some of these policies. I think it's also the fact that, again, like I say, he doesn't have an ideological framework. He's got a practical framework, and that's probably why he's been able to jump between at various times being registered as an independent, a Democrat, and a Republican. He's got a strong element of old-fashioned conservatism in him as well, with states' rights, with the courts, with the military. But he's also got characteristics which you describe as classic New York Democrat. What's also important, I think, is he is sticking by his reinvention of how he communicates, especially with his base. Even now that he's in power, he's still essentially communicating the way he did in the campaign. Rallies and tweets, not press conferences and not speeches. That's important, and the conflict that he's had with the media since he's assumed office, and before that, for that matter, is both, I think, a sign of his communications approach, but also a product of it. Last of all, he's not, I think, terribly interested in foreign policy. He's not terribly interested in diplomacy. He's not terribly interested in the Middle East either. I think certainly not the grind of it. He's not a detailed policy person in any respect. But my hunch is that he really doesn't like the detail and the grind of intelligence or foreign policy making or the detail of negotiation. So what we see from that is a fairly slow start, but some of this is avoidable slow start, and some of this is perhaps more a product of some of the controversies and difficulties that he's faced. I think given his dislike of foreign affairs, he was never going to give it as much time as some presidents do. But then he's had extra delays. I mean, the delays in getting senior people into the State Department in particular, but also into defence and other agencies is a particular problem. And by all accounts, particularly State has been almost dysfunctional or non-functional since Inauguration Day, because there's, apart from the Secretary and a handful of senior people, most of the appointees are not vetted and approved yet, and are not in place. The other thing is Trump seems to be unsure of exactly what his inner circle ought to look like. And just in the few months we've had already since Inauguration Day, we've seen the power of Steve Bannon sort of wax and wane. We've had Michael Flynn as the shortest ever national security advisor in American history. We've had some what looks like disputes between either Bannon and some of the secretaries, or between cabinet members over appointments. There's also, of course, in the background, this real possibility of a serious scandal over Russian influence in the 2016 campaign, which has probably at least been a distraction to Trump. Even if there's nothing there in that, it's still a distraction to him. It's still something that's probably taken his attention more than he would have liked. So to me, that's, I guess, the sort of best thing I can say about why things seem to have moved rather slowly. When we have seen events, as we did with the US strikes on Syria last week, it's something which I think is particular to events. It was particular to the use of chemical weapons last week, and it's essentially a reactive policy on the part of Trump. It may have suited him to strike as and when he did. I suspect it was, if only briefly, it was calculated to have an effect across a fairly broad array of foreign policy. I think he was not just thinking of Bashar al-Assad when he ordered those strikes. I think he was thinking of how this would be perceived in Moscow and Beijing, for that matter in North Korea as well. So to the extent that he was contextualizing the decision to make those military strikes, to the extent that he was planning to have these somehow contribute to wider foreign policy, I think it was probably still a fairly short-term process of decision-making that he adopted, and a very practical one. One of the areas, probably the first thing to say about foreign policy, one of the few things where Trump has been consistent for years, and I mean years, going back even there's statements back in the 80s on Islamic extremism in various guises. This is one of the things where Trump was very consistent in the campaign, and where he's been seemingly very consistent and very clear for a long time. The problem is that ISIS is a particularly difficult foe to genuinely destroy, because destroying it is not just part of a military effort, which is probably going to be the easy bit, but it's also about how we make sure that ISIS doesn't suddenly become, like Al-Qaeda, a predecessor to something yet worse, and how we make sure that the defeat of ISIS is a comprehensive ideological, sociological, theological defeat, not just a military one. So I would expect, even though the Battle of Mosul has gone even more slowly than people might have predicted, I think likewise the final battle for Raqqa will be similar. The military aspect here is still the simpler part of this equation of how to defeat ISIS. It depends depends on a few things. It's now becoming clear that there will be a shift of some sort in US policy against Bashar al-Assad remaining in power. It's essentially a product of these events last week. Before that, it made a lot of sense not to mess around with that, to essentially follow what some of the administration figures have been saying was policy, which was to not worry about Assad yet, to have ISIS defeated, to find a way to a ceasefire, and then to worry about the longer-term future of Assad. And probably, I think the American thinking was that would be some form of either negotiated or pacted transition with Bashar leaving power, or perhaps they were also thinking of an electoral process, even if that's perhaps less likely. But a lot's going to depend here on how US-Russian relationship goes. That in turn, I think, is going to be informed very much by whether there's a repeat of the chemical attacks, a repeat of the US strikes on Syria. But it will also depend on whether Trump can negotiate some sort of larger arrangement with Russia. He's probably got to decide whether he'll let Russia essentially retain control over the parts of the world that Russia considers far more important to it than to Washington. So Trump may decide that it's worth surrendering Ukraine or some other places to Russia in exchange for perhaps getting a deal that incorporates certainly Iran and maybe Syria. The other question, of course, is what the American public will accept, whether they will accept a sort of a long-term integrated policy approach to the Middle East after the military defeat of ISIS, or will they simply be so sick of the Middle East and yet another conflict of the Middle East that they'll expect American troops, aid, engagement to all be pulled out of the region very quickly. But to me, the consistency of Trump on Islamic extremism means that I think if I was going to put money now on what a Trump doctrine, quote unquote, if there is one, what a Trump doctrine will be, I would expect it to be something like a war on Islamic fascism or a war on sort of uber Islamic extremism. I think that's probably the key thing when Trump looks around the world, probably the key long-term underlying and diverse threat that he sees. And thinking about it at different layers, it probably suits his other policies as well. This is an issue. Extremism is an issue on which he can probably feels like he can reach an agreement with Moscow or Beijing in terms of coordinated response to Islamic extremism. It's consistent with his worldview. It's consistent with how many of his allies in the Middle East will perceive not just ISIS but other extremist groups. It's going to be reasonably popular at home if he's going to be engaging in the Middle East at all. These are just some charts more for background and context and things like that. But that top one, which is a reasonably recent, about a month-old map of Syria, just shows you the current state of the different forces controlling Syria and Iraq. ISIS has become very fragmented. Its footprint in a lot of that area that it controls in Syria is probably also much lighter than it was previously. Its support base across the Middle East is not insignificant, but not enormous either. It's normally in most countries single-digit figures. Somewhat worrying is that Tunisian figure, where for a range of reasons, which we can perhaps talk about in Q&A, Tunisia has produced more ISIS fighters than per capita than any other country. The bottom left chart there just shows you where the ISIS and the ISIS-leaning forces and the Iranian-leaning groups are around the region, and the bottom right is sort of a map of control of Mosul. Again, a few weeks old now, but still broadly accurate. The main thing there is the battle there for the western side of Mosul. It sort of looks as if ISIS is on the run there, but it is more complex than it looks, because that western part of Mosul is, of course, far more intricate, far smaller streets. The old part of the city is in there as well. So that western side of Mosul is actually going to be more difficult than the eastern side to capture. And the battle for Mosul may well continue longer than we would like to see. In Iran, and Iran actually is not just a unique country in the Middle East, although it certainly sees itself as such. It is Syria's main backer. It is also, though, a country that has a very unique relationship with the US, and that American-Iranian relationship and the way they see each other is, there's a wealth of stuff there for scholars, and there's been an enormous array of work done on just why the US and Iran have that such a venomous and powerful hatred of each other. And I think in part it stems from a couple of things. I mean, their shared history has been terribly unfortunate, but what their shared history has done is it's sent both sides a message that the other one simply doesn't play by civilized rules. Even though when it comes down to it, both sides can behave in very pragmatic ways as well. But when Iran looks at the United States, it says, look, this country came in, it overthrew a democratically elected prime minister in the country in 1953, it messed around, it supported a Shah that was repressing us, it sold him weapons which he used to repress us and which were bought with oil wealth that belongs to everybody. And then it's now had sanctions against us and picked on us ever since the revolution, with no understanding of why we might have had a revolution against the monarchy. Civilized, nice countries don't do this. They don't meddle like that. They don't try and make a mess of other countries like that. But the Americans look at Iran and they see exactly the same sort of strange, they feel almost, I think, confounded by the way in which Iran does or doesn't play by rules. They look at Iran and they say, what government of any reasonable sort would hold hostages from an embassy for 444 days like this, that would humiliate them, threaten to execute them? States don't behave like that. And so I think there's this mutual misunderstanding here of just how much these two sides feel aggrieved and why. And it's very unusual, the sort of language between them, the way in which the US and Iran talk about each other. The mad mullahs, the great Satan, when they use language like that, that's not normal in diplomatic circles. Even in the Cold War, you compare that to sort of the worst statements coming out of Moscow and Washington in the Cold War would be something like an evil empire, we will bury you, or something like that. That's the sort of language you had from superpowers that were competing with each other. Here, to talk about mad mullahs and your opponent is Satan, is far more powerful language. America doesn't even use this. America and Cuba don't even use that degree of language with each other, and so it's a very unique. When you start digging around here, it's a very unique diplomatic case study, and one I think which comes from that sense that they've really been treated in an unjust way by the other one. What that means is that to fix something like the nuclear issue, to get to a point where we can have a final resolution of the Iranian nuclear issue, is not just a matter of negotiating the technicalities of an agreement, which is what we essentially have at the moment. It's actually about going further. It's about unwinding a lot of this misunderstanding. And you're not just unwinding genuine grievances, you're unwinding constructed, twisted, exaggerated senses of injustice as well. And you're doing it on both sides. You're doing it from the powerful external actor in the US, you're doing it from the Iranian side as the main protagonist in the issue. That makes it particularly troublesome and difficult to resolve. So if I was a gambler, I would say that the Iranian nuclear deal has a quite modest chance of success at the end of the day. Whether it collapses as the deal itself, whether Iran simply waits it out and then rebuilds a nuclear weapons program, whether the US or an ally winds up attacking Iran, if they think the weapons program has been reactivated. I don't know, it could be any of those, but I think that degree of mistrust there is critical, and not just between the US and Iran, but other Western countries as well to a lesser extent. However, the Iranian government is, I think, also more pragmatic than we often assume. We sort of see public protests in Iran, big sweaty crowds getting angry or burning flags, extreme statements coming from leaders, and we assume that it's irrational ideology that's driving people in Iran. And I think when you look at Iran's behavior, the evidence, though, is the opposite. When they're item by item, when they're confronted with international issues or regional problems or opportunities, they tend to respond in a more pragmatic way. When they're under sanctions, or when they're under the worst of the sanctions, you could almost correlate the degree to which they would not involve themselves politically or mess around with another country with the degree of trade or economic interest that they shared with that country. So in other words, in Central Asia and some other areas where they had quite significant economic interests, they were relatively well behaved. Even in Iraq, they were better behaved than it was often painted, I think. In places where they don't really have economic interests, and didn't and still don't, in the Palestinian territories, in Lebanon, for example, that's where they fought their geopolitical battles and played their geopolitical games. So there is that economic driver to their foreign policy, and there's a pragmatic element there as well. I don't think Iran is the type of state that, even if it had a nuclear weapon, would rush out to use it. They're smart enough to know what it is. And I think what was driving them there was that sense of insecurity from the Iran-Iraq war, having been victims of chemical weapons and having probably used them as well in the Iran-Iraq war. They wanted to avoid a repeat of that. They wanted a sense of security against that. And they wanted to be taken seriously. This is a sort of relatively affordable way to show that they were technologically advanced, militarily advanced, and should be taken seriously. And that's what I think was driving their nuclear program. So it was, at the end of the day, about power calculations and how they'd be seen, and practical, neo-realist type of assumptions, not ideological ones. It's my hunch. There's just some more details there on the Iranian nuclear program, but in particular, you can sort of see in the bottom there some of the economic issues here. The timing of that nuclear agreement, I think, was not a coincidence. Like I say, it was the response to the fact that once sanctions were expanded, particularly into European imports of Iranian oil, in 2013, Iran essentially was cornered. Any practical state had to try and cut a deal. And the one they made was, from an Iranian perspective, not a bad one. It was, Trump, when he criticized it, was not entirely wrong when he said this is putting a nuclear program on ice for 10 years. This is not completely dismantling it. So Iran was able, in that sense, to negotiate a decent deal, but it was, I think, driven very strongly to do so by the economic imperatives that were created by sanctions, but also by other factors. Finally, on Israel and Palestine, and if you ever think the Middle East is depressing, this is a particularly depressing part of it, particularly difficult thing to study, but it's also, of course, if you watch the Middle East long enough, it's the Israeli-Palestinian dispute that I think often sort of drives you to that final frustration of being sick of the region. Once you can finish the sentences of the spokespeople from each side, you sort of know you've been watching it for too long. And at the moment, it's particularly depressing because even though the level of violence is, lower than it has been in some recent years, it is basically at a stalemate, and certainly the prospects at the moment for a two-state solution to be agreed and implemented is extremely low. A number of analysts have essentially given up on that idea of a two-state solution. Some are talking perhaps even just as impractically about a one-state solution. What I think is more likely is something which, at least to those there who are sympathetic to the Palestinians, is particularly depressing and unfortunate outcome for the Palestinians. But this is what I think will be the case, having sort of thought about this for a little bit for the last year or two. Given that Israel has complete control at the moment over the occupied territories, those territories are no longer contiguous. They are deeply politically divided, both between Gaza and the West Bank, and then within the West Bank. You can sort of see on the map there is no contiguous Palestinian territory there. There's really no way for that to be a functional state. Even if you were to remove most of the settlements that are not along the old green line, the old Israel-West Bank border, even if you were to clear the military out of the gaps between some of those pockets of Palestinian area of control or Palestinian population, you don't have the basis there either in the size of the territory or in the economic base of it or in the political culture or in any other respect. There's no real basis there for a proper functional state. Any agreement now would probably be the Palestinian Authority and the West Bank only with Israel. So there would still, it wouldn't be the end of the conflict in the sense that you'd still have the Gaza side of the Palestinian territories to worry about at some future point. So the standard two-state solution, the idea that if you get the Israelis and Palestinians sitting down, twist their arm a bit, they can make some sort of agreement where they trade off territories and refugees and water and borders, I think is further away than ever. And what my thinking is at the moment is that we're probably going to see some sort of Israeli policy that tries to create sort of a semi-autonomous Palestinian quasi-state, but on Israel's terms. And this is something that will be very ungenerous to the Palestinians. And this may be, from the Israeli perspective, this may be seen as the time to do this. To do it with Trump in the White House. Israel's had a very unfriendly administration from their perspective in Washington under Obama. They don't know who might come next, but just a zigzagging of US popular opinion might convince them that 2020 or 2024 will see Democrats back in the White House. So they may be looking at this and saying that Trump now, the next 4 years, is the time to be implementing this. Trump himself is pro-Israeli, sympathetic to Israel. He does want to very clearly demarcate himself from Obama, and we've seen that with even the Syria strikes. Trump couldn't resist pointing out the differences between him and his predecessor. So the Israelis may be sort of thinking in these terms, right? That two-state solution probably won't work. A one-state solution probably won't work. Unilaterally expelling the Palestinians from the West Bank is probably not practical, even with a strong, deep supporter in Washington. It's probably simply not practical. It would effectively destroy Israel's relationship with Jordan, presumably, but it would probably be enough to tip international opinion against Israel, which is not what they want and is not good for Israeli security. So that last point is what you're left with, a unilateral partial annexation of the West Bank and semi-independence for the Palestinians in the remainder. So if I was betting, that's what I would sort of think would be their strategy. Now, down along here, this area near the Jordan River is got less than 5% of the Palestinian population, but it's probably the most important strategic area of the West Bank for the Israelis. They want to have a secure international border and one they control with neighbouring states, even with a relatively friendly neighbouring state like Jordan. They're worried not just about the Jordanian regime, but about extremists and others infiltrating across that border. So the Israelis have always said they want that, that security zone in that area. So what I can sort of envisage them doing is annexing Greater Jerusalem, perhaps even areas beyond the Greater Jerusalem they are already annexed, linking that up to the Jordan Valley, which they would then annex as well. And they'd make the argument, well, look, there's almost no Palestinians there at the moment, but this is central to Israeli security. We need to be there anyway. Maybe we can negotiate it one day in the future, but not now. Not when there's two Palestinian governments, not when both of those governments are dysfunctional, and not when Israeli security is on the line. I'll make an argument to that sort of effect. What's left then is this deeply divided part of the West Bank with roadblocks, checkpoints, settlers' roads, military areas, and all sorts of things. Israel might clean that up a little bit, withdraw from some of those, pull out some of the settlements, annex some of the other settlements that are close to the West Bank Israeli border, that old green line, and then simply say, okay, the Palestinians can have administrative independence in that area. We don't recognise them as a state. We won't allow them to behave as a state. If they try to set up a military, we'll destroy it. But they can administer themselves. They can run their own civil affairs. They can run their own local government affairs. They can worry about their own hospitals or schools. They give them that degree of power. So no sovereignty, no full independence, but enough where they can try and make the argument that they're, doing this in good faith, even if you assume they're not. Whether that will wash with the Trump administration, whether that will be acceptable to the Trump administration, I don't know. I would have said that Netanyahu might just get away with something like that a couple of months ago. I'm not so sure now, because we have seen a subtle moderation in Trump's statements on Israel and the region just in the last month or so. There's some rumours that he may be quite influenced by moderate Arab leaders like King Abdullah in Jordan. There's also the possibility simply that he's hitting the brick wall of reality in the Middle East, and that he knows now he won't be able to operate and maintain relationships with the states he wants to if he's too overtly pro-Israeli. A couple other things to think about. A lot depends now on Russia. We're very, very close now to a new Cold War, if we're not already in one. But by a lot of measures, the tensions between the US and Russia now are as bad as they were at certain points, at least, of the Cold War. Intelligence gathering on the two sides, involvement, direct or proxy states, is at similarly high levels. Whether Trump can actually rebuild that relationship, I now doubt very much. Again, I would have thought perhaps back in the campaign, or even around the time of the inauguration, I thought maybe he could do this. But there's now real tension there, and both sides are saying that the relationship is in trouble. So I don't think Trump can rebuild that Russian-US relationship the way he thought he perhaps could a couple of months ago or last year. However, Vladimir Putin is, again, not an ideologue. He's not a communist. He's not a Marxist. He's not an ideologue of any sort. He's highly pragmatic, and he's essentially thinking in old Cold War geostrategic terms. That does mean that Trump can probably make some sort of bargain with him. And the main issue, I think, actually is not Putin. It's the unpredictability of Trump rather than Putin. That's the issue. Whether Putin will trust Trump if he can't really predict his behavior. If Putin is thinking like an old geostrategist, then what he wants to see is predictable behavior from his opponents. So there could be a grand bargain. I'm starting to think that will simply... I'm starting to think that will be more and more impossible, and that it will look like Bush and Obama, that they simply won't be able to rescue the relationship, and at best it will muddle along. It could be worse. It also depends a lot on how the scandal over Russian involvement in the election actually plays out as well. China is, again, becoming a more, I think, country we can be more optimistic about with US policy. China seems to be getting closer to the US on North Korea. distancing itself from North Korea, being more honest about what its red lines with North Korea are. It's got very pragmatic approaches to the Middle East as well. I'm rapidly out of time. In fact, I am out of time, so I won't go into too much detail here. But certainly that Saudi-Iranian rivalry is a particular issue, though. That's something which is shaping the war in Yemen, the war in Syria, and sort of lack of stability and predictability in a number of other parts of the Middle East. And that's now a strong regional Cold War between two regional powers. Finally, I suppose there's predictions. We don't know what will be thrown at Trump. We don't know what sort of tests he will face. Bashar al-Assad, I think almost invariably, was giving him a test with the chemical weapons. After the statement that removing him was no longer an objective of the US, I think Assad decided to test that with the use of chemical weapons, assuming that he would get away with it. But we don't know whether Putin will try to test him or whether Putin will try to work with him first or maybe take longer to size him up. Whether Iran might test him. North Korea, I think, already is testing him with missiles and quite possibly another nuclear test in the coming week or two. If Israel were to take unilateral action in the West Bank, that would be a test as well from an ally. Trump does seem to be gradually learning a little bit. He's overcoming some of his biases and things that he showed in the campaign. He's probably listening to his bureaucracy a little bit more than he was a couple of months ago, but I don't know if I'd be too optimistic about that. The dynamics within the inner circle will be important, and how those opposed to Trump, from the courts to Democrats to the internal opposition he's got within the Republican Party, will be important as well. That too will constrain him. And we've seen the courts and state-level Democrats constrain him quite effectively with the immigration bans twice now. So quite possibly those domestic opponents have more ability to constrain him than we might think, but who knows? It's early days. There's a map there more for a joke than anything else, but when I did sit down and look at it closely, it did seem rather accurate to me as well. But again, sort of more showing the complexity of the region's politics, but also the complexity of, my enemy's enemy's friend's enemy is my friend or enemy. All that sort of toing and froing of opportunistic relations and opportunistic changes of tactic are captured remarkably well there. Anyway, I shall leave it there, and thank you very much. I'll finish as I try to with some of my lectures at university with some cartoons. The top one here on the left is from during the campaign, talking about the Middle East's choices. One on the right there is, the unembellished face of Trump. Is probably how you translate that. And the last two at the bottom are fairly self-evident. But thank you for listening to me. Thank you for indulging me for longer than I should have spoken for, and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. From now on, we move on to Q&A sessions. Again, this event is filmed, videotaped. So if you come to the microphone to ask questions, I assume that you are okay with being filmed. If you don't like this idea, you can still ask questions from your chair. Okay? So who goes first?
Thank you, Dr. Gray, for your comprehensive lecture. I have a question about U.S. strike on Syria. While President Trump and President Xi Jinping had talk, Trump announced that U.S. attacked Syria. And in East Asia, we have a viewpoint that there was also clear message to North Korea and China. Is there same kind of interpretation or perception in the Middle East? Because I don't know how that strike was perceived in the Middle East. That is my first question. The second question is Israeli-Palestinian conflict. As far as I know, some Arab leaders have already met President Trump, and it seemed that they had productive discussion, but they don't mention anything about Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Do you think Palestinian issue is going to be more marginalized? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Those are both excellent questions. On the first one, yeah, I mean, it seems almost a sort of an evolved consensus after the Syrian strikes that maybe they've served a much wider purpose. I'm still unsure exactly how broad and strategic Trump and his inner circle were being with those. But looking at it now, yes, it looks as if it is a very suitable message to be sending to North Korea, and I think to Moscow as well. Maybe to Beijing. I mean, to those powers, to Russia and China, it sends a message of that Trump is decisive and that Trump is not his predecessor, which is what he made very clear when he was talking about the strikes to the American public as well. So it suits him both in terms of sending a message to them, but with the timing coming as it does, with what looks like North Korean preparations for another nuclear test that would be much more powerful than previous ones, matching that to the missile tests they've done, which now put them potentially only a few years away from having a long-range nuclear missile capability, which I think is a red line for Trump. If North Korean nuclear missiles can reach not just the US, but can reach reliably reach US bases or fleets, then I think that's the point at which he'd feel compelled to take military action against North Korea. So he may well have been thinking that this will send them a very strong message as well, that he is willing to act. And there's an implicit message there, I suppose, about weapons of mass destruction generally as well. The North Korean regime, though, is not the same pragmatic regime. It's predictable up to a point because it's driven by a paranoia based on its 20th century experience of the Japanese occupation, of the war with the South, and things like that. And so that the sort of national trauma, if you want to call it that, of those sorts of things, I think are sort of what drives them, and that's why they perhaps partially actually believe the rhetoric they use when they talk about the fact that they think the outside world is getting ready to attack them. I think it's because they've lived through that experience in the past in another context. But so that it may not, the message may not get through to them. I don't know, and certainly if they don't feel as if they are, if they don't feel as if they're crossing a red line with the US, then I don't think they're going to be deterred from a nuclear test, because a nuclear program is appealing to them for so many reasons. That sort of argument, as in Western media, has started cropping up in Middle Eastern media as well, but I think largely following the sort of consensus that's starting to build around what the strikes might mean, not because they've been interpreted differently in the Middle East. On the Palestinian issue, I mean, well, the Palestinians are, the issue has been marginal for a long time. It's been out of the news, but the Palestinians have never been very popular with their neighbours. They've never been popular in Egypt. In Jordan, it's a very complex relationship because the Palestinian population in Jordan is, of course, the majority of the population. So it's a group which can be a base for the regime there. If things go well, it can be also a source of threat, as it was to Abdullah's father in the early 70s. But yes, the Palestinian issue is becoming more marginal. I think it's recognised that it's not of great economic importance. The relationship of the Palestinian issue to extremism is not as strong as people think. It's actually a very weak relationship. There is still an underlying level of popular opinion in the Middle East, maybe 15 to 20% of the Middle East, who would, if you're polling them, where there's polls that ask something to the effect of, do you have any sympathy for Islamic extremists? When people give an answer that is to the effect of sort of, it's normally about 20% of the population, but it varies country by country. But it's normally around 20%, and what they almost invariably say is yes, and the reason is that is the Palestinian issue. Particularly US policy towards Israel, US support for Israel, and the fact that the Palestinians are treated the way they are and nobody seems to do anything about it. And these extremist groups do still talk about the issue far more than incumbent regimes and leaders do. So it's a little bit of an issue in that sense, but that's about the extent of it. And most, when you travel across the Middle East, the degree of genuine sympathy for the Palestinians is surprisingly low.
Thank you very much for your remarks. I'd like to actually follow up on the question about public opinion, because apparently you've picked up on the polling. My memory of polling toward in Iran, a favorability to the U.S. is higher than most Arab countries, not an Arab country, but Middle Eastern countries. And because you mentioned how hostile the bilateral relationship is with the U.S. So on the public opinion side, it's actually pretty positive. And Secretary Kerry worked out this agreement. So a certain level and certain elements of the foreign ministry in Iran, it's also pretty good. And compare that, because you said you could say something more about Tunisia. I was there a few years ago working for some time, and I did get that unanimity of opinion that you just expressed, that I didn't hear any voices of anti-Semitism, but pretty uniform anti-Israel. That's something very different. But how would you explain that 13% support for ISIS? Also, on a proportional basis, I've read it's the largest source of ISIS fighters from any Middle Eastern country. Perhaps what I did see is that the Tunisians are very pro-European, pro-Western in the large sense. So maybe traditional Muslims who are not part of that thinking or have more appeal, in the same way that modern Iranians who are not in sync with their government become more pro-American. Thank you.
Thanks. Those are great points. And yeah, it's something I didn't mention with the Iranians, but it's certainly the Iranian thinking, but I think there's a strong element of truth to this, is that the Iranians see themselves as very sophisticated, and I think they are to a large extent. The cultural sophistication is there. There's a surprisingly strong understanding of the outside world. There's a deep curiosity with younger people towards the outside world, which is often sort of missed. I haven't been there for many years now, but sort of I remember when I was wandering around Esfahan, and sort of just a couple of times I had young people come up and just want to talk to me and practice English, but their questions when they started asking about the outside world was always sort of from what we see on TV, and not government TV, but what we see on cable TV. Is this sort of accurate? Is this really what the Western world's like? And I was very surprised by this. I sort of thought, I expected you guys to sort of ask me about Israel or something, and it surprised me. This young 17, 18-year-old just sort of said, well, Israel's developed and we're not, so that tells me something. The questions from these, it was only a couple of pairs of people I was talking to, it's not a big group, but it was fascinating to me how what was lurking behind all these questions was sort of social freedom and economic opportunity and things like that, but a very sophisticated understanding of what's out there. They know what the outside world looks like. They know what freedoms they don't have. They understand the constraints of their own system and things like that. And there is that strong secular stream in Iran as well. There's a strong proportion of the population that rightly or wrongly remember the Shah's period favourably, or want to get back to that sort of secularism. whether it's out of resentment for the current system or just missing the wealth and opportunity they had. To me, that sort of, the division there in Iran is really what then dictates the opinion towards the US. Iran does make the same distinction that some parts of the Middle East make. The Gulf states, Jordan, even Egypt to some extent, people make a distinction between American foreign policy and American culture or technology. So you can have polling that's sort of, where there's no clear answer of how favourably people see the US overall. What you get is, say, 90% that oppose American foreign policy. But then you'll get, say, 50 or 60% that like American popular culture. And then you might get 80 or 90% that have a respect for the American education system. Even figures, I think it was around 60 or 70% that say they admire the American political system. And the Iranian figures, such as I've seen, I haven't seen as much on them, but they were roughly similar. People make those distinctions in a way that we often don't see with Western polling on Middle Eastern countries. The audience in the Western world often takes these places holistically, and then they're often overly skewed by that impression of terrorism that they've got. So there's sort of a very high negative rating for these countries based essentially on the fact that terrorism often occupies people's thoughts. They don't divide it down and say, oh, well, you know, here's how I'd see Islam, here's how I see oil supply, here's how I see their foreign policy, here's how I see their people one-on-one. They don't sort of make that same distinction. So, yeah, I mean, the prospects, if the US and Iran really could re-establish that, could really sort of move towards a proper re-establishment of the relationship, even kick-starting that process, there's a critical mass of people in Iran, I think, who would want to see that work. But there is at the same time enough underlying opposition. I mean, certainly with elites in the Iranian system, with clerics, bureaucrats, others that are entrenched in the existing system, but also at a wider popular level. There is a broad group that sort of is anti-American in certain respects, and they will, just as Americans will look at Iran and sort of see them disproportionately in a negative light because of the revolution or the hostage crisis or extremism, so the Iranians also will disproportionately give a weight to foreign policy when they're looking at the Americans and perhaps form a negative view of that. So all that still, I think, has to get somehow, people that want this to work would have to push through that that negativity, some of which is very mythologized or artificial, but you know, that means it's also twisted out of shape and is hard to pull out of people's perceptions. Tunisia is, it is per capita the greatest contribution of foreign fighters to ISIS. There's been a number of fairly spectacular terrorist attacks in Tunisia against foreigners. It's an issue. I mean, where I think it's coming from is that Tunisia was for a long time under Ben Ali one of the most secular of the Arab countries. The headgear was Muslim headgear for women was banned in government buildings there from I think it was the 80s until just after the Arab Spring. The economic reforms that were done there in the 80s and 90s were particularly harsh, especially the downsides of those were felt disproportionately in both rural areas and with urban working classes, which probably had something of a radicalizing effect. People were associating quite dramatic and rapid economic liberalization with a secular regime. And just the level of opportunity in Tunisia at the moment is highly constrained. The economy is struggling because a lot of what it used to live on is just not possible anymore, especially the tourism industry, which is still struggling. So unemployment in tourism was always very, very fragile and seasonal, but it's been essentially depressed now for 6 years. And I think that's made life even more difficult for people that were poor anyway, even when they had employment. So putting all of that together and then the attraction of belonging to a group, the spectacle of violence. You look at some of the stuff, ISIS in its early 6-12 months when it was building its support, say across 2014, it was one of the most remarkable forms of public relations that I've seen in terms of attracting supporters. It wasn't just the spectacle of violence, but I mean, a lot of the images that they were posting online, or if you look at the reporting they used to do on their activities and financing and things, the imagery they had in there was almost, some of it looked like video gaming type of imagery. Some of it was sort of the adventure type imagery that you get with military recruitment around the world. They were incredibly clever with this stuff. So for a Tunisian who sort of feels like they've got very little hope and much less than they had 5 or 10 years ago, and who blames secular governments for that, to then be approached by Islamist groups that offer them a sense of belonging, offer them a generous salary, and offer them a sense of adventure, it's probably just very, very attractive to them. And it's just a feature of Tunisia that sense of injustice, the degree to which there's been that reaction against secularism is strong. I mean, it's strong also in other places, in Egypt and Jordan and elsewhere, but it's particularly powerful in Tunisia for those reasons.
Was that answered? Okay. I have sort of a comment and a question. My comment is that you talked a lot about various places across the Middle East, but you didn't mention the Sunni-Shia divide at all. You just said Islamic extremism and the Arab world, but that really doesn't make any sense at all. For example, if you don't know about the Sunni-Shia background, the whole situation in Iraq and Syria is absolutely meaningless. You would never understand why Hezbollah is fighting for Assad, no matter what, and why Saudi is supporting ISIS and so on. I assume maybe you assume that everybody here knows about this background, but when I talk to Japanese friends, a lot of them have no idea. They say Sunni, Shia, what? Islam is Islam, but it's not. There's no such thing as Islamic extremism. I think I shouldn't lecture you, but just to point that out, ISIS is Sunni extremism. Assad's Alevites, they don't have extremism. It's basically a modern Islam. Iran sponsors extreme. Well, this was Hezbollah, but Ahmadiyas don't have any extremism at all. If all Muslims were Ahmadiyas, we wouldn't even be here. Right, so that was my comment. My question is, again, about this recent, I almost said Clinton, but this recent Trump bombing of Syria. This was asked just now before, but your answer was sort of in that direction that I see on some internet sites, that this is like political 4D chess and sending messages here, sending messages there. But other people are pointing out that recently, and you alluded to that too, the people Trump surrounds himself with, his advisors, they have changed. They've changed a lot. And some people pointed out that a lot of these guys who have come in just over the last 2 weeks, they're really not original Trumpers. They're Clinton people. They're Soros-funded, pro-Saudi, pro-war, pro-regime change. So, and there's a whole big discussion going on among Trump supporters. The Trump haters you can forget anyway, they hate everything, but the Trump supporters are really divided. There are people who say, Trump, no matter what, he's our Führer. And then the other faction says, look, this is not the Trump we voted for. And I think I sympathize with that, because the original Trump was anti-regime change and anti-nation building, anti-meddling, anti-warmongering. And now suddenly I see this 180-degree thing. When I saw that in the news, I almost fell off my chair. So I tend to give some credence to the people who say, this is the people who Trump has stupidly surrounded him, well, stupidly or wisely, depending on what you think, surrounded himself with now, like this Diana Powell character you can look up with Soros, Saudi connections, and this McMahon. I'm not good with names. The guy who has been pushing for a 150,000 army ground troop invasion and all this stuff. This is exactly what Trump for years and years said he did not want, and now we see it. So I wonder if this is just the people who against the Trump agenda have gotten into Trump's ear. That I wonder what my question is. What do you think about that theory? Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. No, I mean, good work picking me up on the Islamic extremism bit, which was essentially laziness on my part. But when I said that, I was pretty much meaning Sunni extremism. The sheer extremism that there is sort of either sectarianism in places like Iraq, or it's sectarian-based groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon. It tends to be not so much extremists that are fighting the state, trying to overthrow it. They're more about protecting Shia interests and Shia bases, and Iran supports them somewhat understandably. And as you say, there's reasons then as to why Iran needs and wants that tie to the Syrian regime, apart from it being really their only key Arab ally. My bad. I should have said essentially Sunni extremism when I'd said Islamic extremism. And I apologise to the audience if I'd been confusing with that, or if I should have explained the sectarian differences. The key thing to think about, I think, with those sectarian differences, though, is to not see them as a theological divide, but to see them simply as a sort of representative factor that can be used to distinguish the other side when there's geopolitical rivalries of various sorts. So the fundamental issue is not between Sunni and Shia is not really around theology anymore. When these communities get on well, and in countries where they do get on even satisfactorily, the difference is negligible theologically and in terms of intercommunal relations. If you go back in Iraq 30 years ago or somewhere like that, you'd see Sunni and Shia, if they were travelling in each other's districts, stop and sometimes even use each other's mosques. Something you'd never see with Christians, with, say, Catholic and Anglican Christians. So it's not theology, but it is Iran painting itself, its particular form of Iranian nationalism, as being deeply embedded with its Shia identity. It's about Saudi Arabia and others believing that they're sort of Saudis in particular believing they're the frontline defenders of Sunni Islam, and seeing that that is the key, to them, the key interpretation of the religion. But there's also the practicality that the Saudi regime is influenced by the clerics, where there's a bargain essentially between the royal family and the clerics for mutual symbiotic support. So things get framed in these sectarian ways, but not usually because of the theological arguments between them. Much more commonly, it becomes a convenient way of badging oneself or rivals. That's a very good and interesting point on Trump's changing inner circle, and it is changing. People are starting to get into these senior appointments now. People like McMaster do have that more conventional background, I suppose, of the military, but that more conventional understanding of foreign policy as well. I'm not sure exactly who had Trump's ear to what extent in the case of the strikes on Syria, and there are so many explanations of who it may have been, but I haven't seen a lot that says it was people like McMaster. I've seen it much more commonly described as anything from Trump's daughter to King Abdullah of Jordan to Trump just being personally sickened with what he saw on TV and changing his mind. But for whatever reason, that second tier of advisors is becoming more influential, and we're seeing that, very interestingly, we're seeing that in quite overt cases. And the other classic one is something like the UN ambassador, is it Nikki Haley, who, who's essentially become the sort of the more vocal spokesperson for State Department policy even than the secretary. And certainly her public statements have been more in line with what Trump has eventually done than what Tillerson has said, which is fascinating in itself. Tillerson is meant to be her boss, and in a lot of systems she wouldn't be able to sort of speak up like that and say things that weren't consistent with what her boss was saying. So that second tier is becoming, of the bureaucracy is becoming more important, but the question I think with the strike on Syria would be who had his ear, and I haven't seen anything that's convincing enough for that. Even if that sort of circle gets his ear, I think Trump is still going to eventually have his own limits of what he's not willing to do. I don't think he's necessarily going to be at the mercy of these types. Even if Bannon's power is waning at the moment, he's there essentially offering in the domestic political interpretation of how things will go down if he makes particular decisions with his base. Trump, the advantage I think, but it's also a disadvantage of the way Trump communicates, is that there's people almost through Twitter have a direct line to him. If he's reading any of the tweets, he must be reading some of the tweets that appear online. He's going to get a particular impression of how his base is thinking from that. So he should have at least enough basic instincts there to be able to interpret some of that stuff, how his base is going to see stuff like that. And I think perhaps the overarching worry for Trump is to wind up with an Obama-style legacy. He doesn't want to be like Obama because he sees him as weak, as part of the elite, part of the system. Sees him as gutless. He sees him as a sort of president who was a walkover, who let Putin walk over him, Assad, the Iranians and others, and North Korea. So I think Trump's natural instincts, whether it's in terms of his ego or just listening to his base, will act as a sort of natural barrier. I don't think he'll become completely whipped or controlled by that second tier of the bureaucracy, but they may well have a greater impact on him, and that would perhaps be no bad thing, because even if they are going to sort of make him a little bit more Obama-esque or Bush-esque or whatever, perhaps that's what's needed, is people with real experience that, whether they like the Beltway or not, at least know how it works, and who can give him that level of advice. Because Bannon and some of the others there can't give him that advice. They don't really sort of know how to balance the Washington elite with mass opinion, especially in Trump's base. So that's my hunch, is that Trump won't let himself get dragged that far off course, but I don't know. So far he's been unpredictable.
Matthew, could I ask you about the energy situation? If you look at the United States, maybe over the next 5 to 10 years, it will become increasingly energy independent. So I'm just wondering if you think that will influence their, the way they look at the region over the next 5, 10 years. My second question was just quickly on Assad. I mean, the evidence against him on video, various other mediums, seems to be overwhelming. Could you make a prediction about how you think that situation might play out over the next few months? And the third question was just on the nuclear power situation. As you may know, United Arab Emirates are going to bring a reactor online next year. Saudi are talking about building 8 reactors in the eastern part of the country, and Jordan are talking about building a Russian reactor. Do you think this is going to make the region even more unstable? Thanks.
Thanks. On energy, I think you're more of an expert than I am, so I don't know if I can tell you anything that you don't know, but the region is genuinely unsettled. The Gulf states, at least, are genuinely unsettled by what they see as a fragmentation of the global energy order. What they see in the oil sector is this rise of unconventional oil, which is changing the dynamics. the emergence of some new players, but especially that the resurrection of the American oil industry and of unconventional oil. And they see it as a threat to a certain extent. I mean, part of the reason the Saudis have been happy to suppress prices and see them kept down now for a couple of years is partly to place economic pressure on Russia, which is sort of, I think, their main sort of rival for energy influence globally, if you want to put it in those terms. But it was also, I think, to try and put real pressure onto the American unconventional producers as well. In gas, likewise, you've got new gas powers emerging, as we were talking about before, that Australia is about to overtake Qatar now as the world's biggest producer of natural gas. And I mean, the arguments in the Gulf in the gas sector are essentially, they're particularly nervous in Qatar because they don't have as much long-term, they don't have as many long-term contracts as most states do. So Qatar's particularly frustrated and worried here. But their argument essentially was, look, you know, if Russia or Central Asia can essentially capture the European market, if Australia can capture the Far East, what's left for us? You know, we can send some gas to our neighbours, as we currently do. We can send some to South Asia. Otherwise, we're at the mercy of spot markets and spot sales, and they're very nervous about that because they've built up enormous debt building the gas capacity that they've got at the moment. But that's now been on hold for several years because I think they know without these long-term contracts they really can't be sure that it's worth investing further, especially with low oil prices dragging gas prices down. So where it'll go in the next few years, it depends ultimately on price. But the mistake most of the Gulf has made is that the prices they need for oil, in particular, to balance state budgets is now so high that it's unrealistic. It's anything from, in most of these countries, it's anything from $60 to $130 a barrel. And it's really only in the UAE and Qatar, because of its gas wealth, and one or two others, that they can be making money at the sort of current oil prices. But most of them, as much money as they might be making, can't balance their budgets comfortably with the amount of largesse, the amount of co-optation that they want to be able to wield over their populations. They just can't do that at the current price. And so they're feeling a pressure there. They're feeling as if that bargain of no taxation and no representation is coming under strain and will come under further and deeper strain if prices stay low too long. It's perhaps within the power of the Saudis in particular to play with the price a little bit, but they don't have the swing producer sort of price setting capacity that they once did. So I think the region feels, with unconventionals, with the fragmentation of suppliers, feels as if they're in a weaker position than they used to be. They probably are, and they probably are. They probably never had quite the power that they imagined either. You know, if you look at the sources of U.S. oil imports, even when people had assumed in the 80s and 90s and 2000s that oil was driving American foreign policy, the U.S. was still only getting a minority of its oil from the Middle East. The bulk of its oil was being purchased by firms, not by the government. So there's still, at the end of the day, not really a lot that the US government can do to wean America off Middle Eastern oil. And given that it's the sort of cheapest stuff out there pretty much to extract, you know, there's commercial realities there that are going to keep the Middle East, I think, particularly important no matter what, but also, you know, I don't believe that US policy was as driven by oil as what people often imagine. Assad, the thing with the evidence with Assad is it depends on whether you trust the American intelligence community. If the rumors of the intelligence that they've got are true, then the evidence is overwhelming, almost incontrovertible. If they've really got the radar signals from this airbase near Homs of the aircraft following it, tracking it over the town twice, at the same time as there was bombing, at the same time as the chemicals were supposedly released, and then returning to that base. And then on top of that, today there's the reports that sort of after they were told to revisit the intelligence around this, that they've found intercepted conversations in advance of the strike talking about it quite openly. And no evidence of Russian involvement, although that may just be because the Russians are better at protecting their conversations than the Syrian government. We don't know. So if all of that stuff is true, then the evidence is overwhelming. But in the past, it's very strong evidence both sides have used chemical weapons of various sorts in the past. So it doesn't seem to me likely that the rebels would have used them on this occasion, or that it was an accident. The Russian argument that it was an accident is particularly weak, because normally if you were to accidentally bomb a chemical weapons plant, you would destroy the chemical weapons, not release them.
Sorry, Matthew, I wasn't just referring to the Idlib situation. I was talking about, some of the other videos that are coming out about, the war crimes that are being committed in some of the Air Force bases and, prisons around Syria. That seems to be absolutely overwhelming.
Yeah, I know it is. Look, it's always been known that this was an unappetizing regime, but a number of them in the Middle East are. The number of political prisoners in Syria back before the Arab Spring was on average around 15,000, so it was a substantial number of people. Over time, that becomes a substantial number of Syrians that have been arrested, held, and usually tortured. But the Middle East itself sort of tells rather dark sort of jokes about this sort of stuff. I wouldn't say they expect this of governments, but they understand that it's pretty much the political reality of the world they live in. I remember asking a Jordanian friend about this, and he said, yeah, our government is much better. We have a saying that, if you want somebody arrested and roughed up, you send them to Egypt. If you want them brutally tortured, you send them to Syria. And if you just want them to disappear, you send them to Jordan. And the way it was told was sort of almost this expectation of all these governments are nasty, but the distinction is between what type of nasty, I suppose. But the Syrian government is a nasty one. There's the argument that you can then have about what's needed. Can you have a government that holds these sort of countries together that's not like that? With the history of these countries and the divisions they've got and the economic problems they've got, it's difficult to imagine other governmental models being successful there. And I hate to say it, but I don't necessarily expect much better until governments have real co-optive power, and that's why the authoritarians of the Gulf are much softer authoritarians, because they can literally afford to be. The final question on nuclear stuff in the Gulf, I am not well informed on this, so I almost feel like I should take that on notice. But from what I've sort of seen of it, there's a transparency in what the Gulf states are doing, at least, which is far superior to what we've seen with North Korea and Iran, which probably gives them that, plus the way they're seen in Washington, gives them the chance to get away with doing this, where Iran, even if it really did only want a civilian program, was probably never going to have enough trust in the US to get away with that. I guess there's risks that you can see attached to this. Of nuclear accidents or of governments changing in these countries, which is certainly the case with Iran, where the US, the Ford administration strongly supported an Iranian civilian nuclear program, which became the basis for later what we think was a nuclear program. So there is that sort of longer term risk, but then you're playing with hypotheticals with that. Otherwise, the argument of these countries to have that type of thing, to have a nuclear energy program, is fairly strong. People always say, oh, if they've got all this oil and gas, why do they need nuclear? And the answer is because they want to extract and export every drop of the oil and every whiff of gas. So it makes sense to them to build up that nuclear technology to free up more hydrocarbons for export. And that was always the Iranian argument of why they were doing what they were doing. Whether it's something to support, I suppose, with checks with suitable controls on the size of the reactors and whether they can be turned into something that can produce weapons-grade material. Maybe that sort of control would be enough to make it worth permitting. But I must admit, that's one I haven't followed very well, so I'm sorry.
I've been told that this is going to be the last question tonight, so thank you very much for your informative talk so far. As a student here that studies international affairs, I think it's really helpful to get as much knowledge on the Middle East while I still can. So one thing that I noticed that was missing from your presentation tonight, Professor, was I think the elephant in the room for the Middle East, the Kurds and the Kurdish situation and the Kurdish question, because in many, many different Arab states in the Levant, there are sizable Kurdish populations, and I was wondering what's your opinion on how the Donald Trump administration is going to deal with Kurdish forces that are currently fighting against Sunni Islamic extremism and all of the other situations where Kurds are fighting for statehood in many ways. And a second part of that question is the Turkish issue. Turkey is currently fighting Kurdish insurgent groups on its eastern boundaries and also bombing Kurdish organizations in northern Syria and western Iraq as well. So because Turkey's a NATO country and a NATO ally of the United States, and they're having their own issue with going a little bit more authoritarian, and we don't have enough time to probably go into that. I was just wondering what's your opinion on the United States, the Trump administration's response to Kurdish organizations that are supporting the United States currently, but that might annoy some of our other allies, such as Turkey. So thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Well, I think at a tactical level, there's probably the view that the Kurds are a useful ally. They're useful in Syria in particular as military allies, and they are traditionally very secular. They're got a reputation, particularly the Iraqi Kurds, with their experience of being good fighters, but the evidence is the ones in Syria ain't bad either. And so that's that first level of analysis, I suppose. It looks as if it may be worth cultivating them, working with them, etc. And that's been the case to a certain extent as well. The US has been working with them. But at a deeper level, as you say, to actually start fragmenting or breaking up the countries in the region, which is what genuine Kurdish independence would mean essentially allowing a breakup of Turkey, Iran, Syria. There is a Kurdish population in Iran as well. That's where this becomes an issue, and the views on whether that's the intention of the Kurds to eventually gain full independence or just to gain a degree of protection and autonomy the views on that seem to change all the time, depending partly on the economy and their ability to economically sustain themselves, and depending on how relations go with the capital. This is especially the case with Iraqi Kurds, where when there's tension with Baghdad, as there was a couple of years ago or a year or two ago, I see a lot of stuff saying, this would probably trigger Kurdish demands for independence if they're not careful. But when prices were higher and there was money to be made, then you'd say, well, they're probably happy to sort of chug along and protect their citizens, have stability in the area, which itself is good for Iraq, and a better standard of living and things than what they've traditionally had, or what the rest of Iraq certainly has. I don't think there's a great appetite to break up Iraq, in part because it would mean allowing possibly some sort of breaking in three with a sort of Arab Shia state in the south. And Iranian influence in those Shia cities in southern Iraq is already extensive, overwhelming. Iran sort of essentially controls virtually controls the economies of Najaf and Kabul. So I think there's a view there that you would automatically have a still higher degree of Iranian control over any southern Iraqi state. Any sort of full independence for Iraqi Kurds, I think, would be too much of a worry for Turkey, and so it would wind up, again, as you say, as being something that the US would object to, if only because it's so unpalatable to Turkey. I was sort of wondering at one point whether there might be a Russian sort of, part of what I think is Putin's geostrategic goal is to divide that Western alliance, which he sees as something which at the moment is militarily and economically superior to Russia. Whether part of his goal is to actually break apart that alliance, and if he sees Turkey as one of the handful of weak points where he could do that. If that's the case, then the prospects of Russia starting to intervene there would become realistic. But that depends a little bit on where that relationship goes. It was going fairly well for Russia. Putin has, over the last year or so, improved that relationship with Turkey very substantially. But we've just seen now with the strike on Syria that differences re-emerge. And so if Putin has that sort of power, I don't think he has that sort of ability to turn Turkey against NATO and against the US. But if he did, there's less prospect still of it now, I think. So the only issue I can really sort of see is if there's pressure created by a sort of inevitable independent or quasi-independent Kurdish Syrian territory. And we're a long way from the end of the civil war, so we're a long way from that becoming formalised or any state like that being recognised or asking for autonomy. There's years to go, I suspect, until that becomes an issue. And so at the moment, I think it's just going to chug along. It's going to be more of what we've seen. The Kurds will try and get an economic base that would help them if they're an independent state. They'll try to build up their state-like capacity, the capacity of institutions, their diplomatic connections, particularly the Iraqi ones, but that's more because they have that semi-state capacity already. But I can't see a scenario in the coming years where we'd see an independent Kurdish territory in that area. Longer term, though, it becomes more plausible, perhaps depending on what happens in Syria, depending on how the Kurds can play this, or even whether they could, say the Iraqi Kurds could actually negotiate with the Turkish government to accept an Iraqi, not a Turkish Kurdish state. They may do that if there were guarantees with the oil pipelines and with trade, with investment, things like that. It becomes plausible in the long term that Turkey would do that if they thought they had enough control over their own Kurdish population.
Well, thank you very much. We are running out of time, so we have to stop here. If you want to receive our email alerts, announcements, and invitations for the upcoming events of ICAS, please drop your Meishi or business card. And also, again, we have donation boxes, so we appreciate your intellectual and financial contributions. So thank you very much.
Thank you.